the secret steel and its horrifying function. The American invasion of Iwo Jima was a massive undertaking, and as the fifth wave of U.S. Marines slammed into the beaches, they were accompanied by their armored support. Rolling off their landing craft were the recognizable shapes of the Sherman tanks. Yet, a critical subset of these vehicles, numbering just 8, carried a devastating secret. From the outside, they looked identical to every other Sherman tank, but internally, they had been completely redesigned to wield a weapon far more terrifying than a standard cannon. These were the flame tanks. These 8 tanks, representing a tiny fraction of the total force, were destined to have an outsized impact on the battle's gruesome final tally. They would collectively account for an astonishing and disproportionate share of the conflict's grim mathematics, responsible for roughly 1/3 of all Japanese casualties. The manner in which they achieved this was arguably the most horrifying way imaginable, by projecting fire and superheated destruction into the enemy's fortified positions. The crews who operated these terrifying machines were to be a huge, decisive part of winning the battle for the island. Their job was to drive their heavily armored weapons straight into the teeth of the enemy's most entrenched defenses. While the armor protected them from many common forms of attack, some of the flame tank crews would ultimately pay a terrible price for wielding this unique and fearsome weapon. The decision to field these fire-projecting tanks was rooted in mankind's age-old practice of weaponizing fire. History shows that from the earliest times, people have continuously sought new and often ghastly ways to use fire against one another. One of the best early examples was the legendary Greek fire, which could be seen as the progenitor of the flamethrower. This was a pressurized burning mixture used by the Byzantines in naval battles, sprayed onto enemy ships with such effectiveness that even water could not put it out. To this day, the exact formula for Greek fire remains a mystery, and its legend as one of the most feared weapons of the ancient world is testament to the enduring power of controlled fire in warfare. As the centuries passed, fire continued to appear on the battlefield, sometimes in methods that sound completely insane today, such as setting animals like pigs on fire and sending them running toward enemy lines purely to cause chaos and panic. However, the true modern flamethrower, the weapon that the flame tanks of Iwo Jima were built to deploy, would not appear until the brutal, stagnant trench warfare of the First World War. It was the Germans who first brought the modern flamethrower, the Flammenwerfer, to the battlefield. This was part of many desperate attempts to break the devastating, long-running deadlock that defined trench warfare. When the first streams of fire spewed across no man's land, Allied soldiers were initially more shocked by its terrifying appearance and sound than by its sheer lethality. It began as more of a psychological weapon, preying on the primal fear of being burned alive. However, the weapon's effect on the human body quickly cemented its genuinely terrifying and deadly reputation. These early flamethrowers were notoriously dangerous to their own operators. There were several tragic incidents where German squads were killed by their own weapons due to sudden, unpredictable wind changes or system failures. Even during World War I, there were tentative early experiments with mounting these fire weapons onto tanks, but those efforts never developed into a significant operational capability. After the war concluded, most nations essentially forgot about the flamethrower, paying it little attention. This would all drastically change once the United States found itself locked in a vicious, island-hopping war against the Imperial Japanese forces in the Pacific Theater, setting the stage for the powerful flame tanks that now sat ready on the beaches of Iwo Jima. The Marines' burden and the price of fire. Before the terrifying flame tanks could roll ashore and dominate the battle, the American military had to grapple with the capabilities and inherent dangers of the handheld flamethrower. On the eve of the Second World War, the Allied forces possessed a few designs, but there was a distinct lack of enthusiasm for the weapon. There were no dedicated flamethrower units established. They appeared only here and there in a few rare instances, and that was the extent of their deployment. That sentiment changed dramatically when reports began filtering in that German troops were successfully integrating flamethrowers into their assault tactics. This battlefield evidence pushed American planners back to the drawing board, forcing them to quickly hurry a new round of handheld designs into development. These designs arrived in the field first, long before any armored flame tanks rolled off a landing craft. The handheld flamethrower was a strange contradiction in a single weapon. It was the best and worst kind of weapon at the same time. On the one hand, it could achieve what rifles and hand grenades could not, effectively and completely clear an enemy position by burning the personnel inside. While grenades could also technically do the job, understanding the nature of the fortifications on Iwo Jima, the deep tunnels and intricate pillboxes, made it clear why the flamethrower was often the only truly effective solution. The American military developed the M1 flamethrower, designed in a cumbersome backpack configuration that the operator had to carry. It featured a nozzle that the Marine could aim at whatever target needed incineration. The system consisted of 2 large tanks that held about 5 gallons of the flammable mixture, and positioned between them was a smaller tank containing compressed nitrogen gas. This gas was necessary to propel the mixture in a pressurized jet, giving the weapon a maximum range of only about 20 to 40 yards at best. When fully loaded, this contraption weighed in at a hefty 70 pulpires. This full load gave the operator approximately 7 to 10 seconds of continuous firing time before the fuel was exhausted. The mixture, upon exiting the nozzle, had to be ignited. Early models used an unreliable electrical system with batteries, which was later wisely changed to a more robust pyrotechnic ignition system. This new system used a couple of white phosphorus flares that could be activated, burning long enough to reliably ignite the fuel mixture as it shot out. The fuel itself was a devastating cocktail of diesel, gasoline, and a napalm compound, which created a sticky substance. This mixture, burning at approximately 1500 degrees Fahrenheit, would cling tenaciously to everything it touched. Operators developed an even more deadly tactic. They would first spray the target without igniting the fuel. This soaked the fortification, allowing the sticky mixture to drip deep inside the entrances and openings. Then, a short ignited burst would set everything and everyone inside completely on fire. The effectiveness of the flamethrower in pillbox clearing was unmatched by conventional weapons. Unlike an explosion or fragmentation from a grenade, which could only kill someone directly hit, and fortifications were deliberately built with zigzag patterns and channels to blunt grenade effects, the flame's effect was different and more total. Beyond the direct flames and extreme temperatures, the burning fuel rapidly consumed most of the oxygen inside. So even Japanese soldiers who weren't directly touched by the flames would be severely affected by the crippling heat and the total lack of breathable air, often leading to asphyxiation. This weapon, however, carried an unbearable cost for the user. With 70 blades strapped to their back, an operator had to be within hand grenade range to be effective. The odd-looking backpack was instantly recognizable on the battlefield. Since the enemy knew exactly what fate awaited them if the Marine got close, every weapon they had would be instantly turned on the flamethrower operator. Their lifespan in combat was notoriously short. The terrifying statistics from Iwo Jima would later prove this point in the most brutal way. A staggering 94% of flamethrower operators were killed in the fighting. From handheld vulnerability to armored firepower. The crippling vulnerability and staggering casualty rate of the handheld flamethrower operators in the Pacific made it clear that a new solution was desperately needed. The sheer effectiveness of the weapon in clearing Japanese fortifications was undeniable, but the price paid by the Marines wielding them, reaching a tragic 94% casualty rate on Iwo Jima, was unsustainable. The first time American troops utilized the flamethrower against the Japanese on a larger scale was during the battles in the Solomon Islands. It was there that the catastrophic vulnerability of the operators was quickly recognized by tactical planners. The solution, it was reasoned, was to combine the immense power of the flamethrower with the mobility and, critically, the protection of a tank. This idea was meant to solve both the flamethrower's mobility and the operator's protection problems simultaneously. This push led to the first, though ultimately not very successful, flame tanks. These early versions were experimental conversions of the M3 Stuart light tank. They were fitted with a modified handheld flamethrower system and quickly earned the grim nickname Satan tanks. These light tank conversions managed to roughly double the range of the foot-carried version and could sustain fire for around 40 seconds of continuous operation, a vast improvement over the M1's 7-10 seconds. However, the Satan tanks were plagued by severe deficiencies. They were notoriously unreliable, failing in combat approximately 40% of the time due to mechanical or systemic issues. Even worse, the Stuart's light armor offered virtually no protection against anything heavier than sustained machine gun fire. The vehicle's turret traverse was also severely limited because of the cumbersome nature of the added flamethrower system installed inside. Despite their unreliability, when these tanks did work and managed to reach the enemy without breaking down or exploding, their undeniable effectiveness against deep Japanese fortifications was enough to convince the American military to invest fully in the concept and make it truly work. The combat reports proved that the sheer power of an armored long-range flamethrower was essential for breaking the kind of defenses the Japanese were building across the Pacific. Just 5 months before the planned invasion of Iwo Jima, a specialized team was assembled. Their mandate was to learn from the failures of the earlier Stuart conversions and create a robust, reliable, and truly battle-ready flame tank. This time, the far superior M4A3 Sherman was chosen as the base platform for the conversion. The process to transform a conventional Sherman into a flame-throwing behemoth was complex and required a total redesign. To create a single operational unit, engineers needed approximately 1,200 man-hours of labor. The conversion process also involved using 150 pounds of welding rod, modifying and relocating over 1,000 electrical connections, and fabricating 150 specialized parts specifically for the flame system. After this intense labor, the new superior flame tank was finally completed and ready for action. The cost of converting a single Sherman into this powerful weapon was the modern equivalent of about $350,000. With the base platform established, the engineers turned to maximizing the flamethrower's capabilities, ensuring the next chapter of this terrifying weapon would be one of armored dominance and unparalleled lethality. The fire projector and its technical specs. Having settled on the robust M4A3 Sherman chassis, the design team focused on turning it into the most devastating flame weapon yet conceived, ensuring it would survive and dominate the heavily fortified battlefields of the Pacific. The result was a weapon capable of projecting an unprecedented stream of destruction, all while remaining outwardly disguised. The most noticeable physical change to the Sherman was the replacement of the main gun. In its place, a powerful flame projector was mounted. This projector was fed by an enormous store of fuel mixture, approximately 300 gallons, which was carefully and securely stored inside the tank's armored body. This massive fuel capacity allowed the flame projector to fire a continuous stream of fire for an impressive duration of about 80 seconds. The operational range was a crucial factor for crew safety and effectiveness. This new system was capable of projecting a stream of fire up to 150 yards. This was a huge jump in capability. It was nearly double the range of the earlier failed Satan tanks, and many times the range of the deadly handheld M1 flamethrower. This increased distance allowed the flame Shermans to engage targets, while remaining further away from the most immediate and localized enemy close-range anti-tank fire. However, the powerful weapon system did come with operational limitations, particularly concerning its supply chain. Refueling the tank took a significant amount of time, estimated at roughly 2 hours before the tank could be ready to fire again. Furthermore, the specialized fuel mixture, a sticky compound of gasoline, diesel, and napalm thickener, had to be used within 72 hours of its preparation. Otherwise, the mixture would begin to clog the complex pumping and projection system, rendering the tank inoperable. This necessitated a continuous, demanding logistical effort behind the front lines to ensure the tanks remained active. The rest of the tank's operational specifications mirrored the standard Sherman to maintain consistency and crew familiarity. The turret could traverse approximately 270 degrees, and the elevation and depression angles of the flame projector were engineered to be similar to those of a standard Sherman cannon. Most importantly, for tactical reasons, the conversion was executed with extreme precision to preserve the tank's exterior appearance. The flame Sherman looked just like any other Sherman tank from the outside. This crucial detail was by design. It meant that the Japanese defenders, already facing a high volume of American tanks, could not immediately identify and prioritize the much more lethal flamethrowing variants. Converting a single Sherman to this devastating flamethrowing configuration cost the equivalent of about $350,000 in contemporary value. Just 8 of these specialized vehicles were prepared and made ready for the initial assault on Iwo Jima. They were an expensive, invaluable, and irreplaceable asset that would soon be called upon to break the most formidable defenses ever constructed in the Pacific theater. Their technical capability, to project fire over a vast distance while protected by thick armor, made them the perfect, terrifying answer to the subterranean fortress the Japanese had built. The island fortress in Kuribayashi's plan. While the flame tanks were being prepared, the Japanese were transforming the volcanic island of Iwo Jima into a defensive masterpiece designed for maximum American attrition. The Japanese command knew the strategic importance of the island and had dedicated an entire year to converting it into an impregnable fortress. The island's peculiar terrain was central to their plan. The volcanic rock that made up the 8 square miles of Iwo Jima was easy to dig by hand. The Japanese exploited this geological advantage relentlessly, carving out a vast interconnected subterranean network. They ultimately dug 11 miles of tunnels, established 5,000 caves and underground chambers, and constructed 1,500 heavily fortified concrete positions across the small island. This network ensured their entire defensive force could survive the heaviest bombardment and attack from unexpected angles. The defense was led by General Kuribayashi, who had an estimated 21,000 men prepared to make a ferocious final stand in defense of their homeland. Kuribayashi was a pragmatic and brilliant commander who understood his situation completely. His men would not survive the battle. Therefore, his strategy was not focused on winning, but on making the cost of victory so astronomically high that the Americans might reconsider a full invasion of the Japanese home islands. Kuribayashi's orders were absolute and revolutionary, breaking from established Japanese doctrine. There would be no evacuation and no resupply once the fighting began. Most crucially, he strictly forbade the traditional, often futile banzai charges seen in previous Pacific battles. Instead, he meticulously created a detailed, patient plan designed to bleed the American forces white. Every single man under his command was explicitly told not to die before killing at least 10 Americans. The Americans began their preparatory assault, intending to soften up the island. The Navy slowly approached, and for 74 consecutive days, warships and bombers dropped over 6,800 tons of bombs and fired more than 22,000 shells onto the tiny volcanic rock. However, American Allied intelligence made a severe critical error that negated much of this preparatory bombardment. They naively underestimated the actual Japanese force, believing the island was defended by only about 4,000 troops, instead of the true 21,000. Following this failure, they compounded the error by making the even greater mistake of assuming the island had been bombed into submission. The bombardment was stopped earlier than planned. In reality, the Marines approaching the beaches in their landing craft on D-Day had no idea just how intact the enemy force was. Only about 200 of the 1,500 Japanese fortifications had actually been destroyed. The vast majority of General Kuribayashi's main force was still waiting underground in their virtually intact tunnel network, ready to unleash a kind of devastating close-quarter combat the Marines had truly never seen before. The Marines hit the beaches on February 19, 1945. Though things seemed deceptively quiet at first, soon all hell broke loose as the hidden defenses erupted. By the end of that first night, the Marines had gained less than 700 yards of ground, a minimal advance achieved at the terrible cost of 2,400 casualties. The horrific reality was that the real battle had only just begun. Unbeknownst to the waiting Japanese, however, the answer to their subterranean fortress, the 8 Flame Shermans, had also landed. Initial carnage and the tank's first action. The opening hours of the Battle of Iwo Jima immediately revealed the devastating effectiveness of General Kuribayashi's defensive strategy and the appalling failure of American pre-invasion intelligence. The Marines hit the beaches on February 19, 1945, expecting a weakened enemy, but were instead met with a storm of fire from defenses that had been untouched by the preliminary bombardment. The cost of just that first day was staggering, with the Marines gaining less than 700 yards of ground at the horrific expense of 2,400 casualties. The reality was that the main Japanese force, numbering over 20,000 men, was waiting underground in a virtually intact network of tunnels and strongpoints, ready to show them a kind of merciless combat never before witnessed. Unbeknownst to the Japanese defenders, however, among the fleet of Sherman tanks that had landed with the assault waves were the 8 new and specialized Flame Shermans. These were considered precious, irreplaceable assets, and they were initially kept in reserve for the first 24 hours of fighting, held back until their unique capabilities were absolutely essential to break the deadlock. The order to deploy them came on the morning of the second day of the invasion. The tanks were immediately sent into battle to support Marines who were pinned down by blistering fire from the fortifications. The very first deployment involved Flame Sherman 431, which was dispatched to assist the hard-pressed infantry near the Miami airfield. The tank advanced methodically, moving to within approximately 100 yards of a heavily protected pillbox before opening fire. The stream of ignited napalm erupted from its flame projector, a terrifying sight and sound. The Japanese defenders quickly identified the threat and responded instantly, firing a 47mm anti-tank gun at the imposing vehicle. The shell struck the Sherman, but thanks to the tank's thick frontal armor, the round simply bounced off, causing no damage to the vehicle or its crew. In return, the Sherman sprayed a 15-second burst of fire over the Japanese position, engulfing it completely in flames. This single act of devastating firepower allowed the pinned-down Marines to resume their assault and move forward. This success quickly escalated. Within the next 6 hours, all 8 Flame Shermans were thrown into the action. They began systematically spraying one pillbox after another with intense fire. The sight of these armored vehicles projecting jets of flame had a horrifying immediate effect on the Japanese defenders. Many soldiers, overwhelmed by panic and the sheer terror of being burned alive, began abandoning their positions as soon as the American tanks got close. As the battle grew fiercer each day, the Marines finally had a weapon that could effectively neutralize the stubborn fortifications, the deep concrete bunkers and complex tunnel entrances that had successfully resisted even the heaviest naval bombardments. The Flame Shermans immediately became the critical tool needed to crack open the enemy's subterranean defense system, proving that the solution to a deep-dug fortress was not necessarily greater explosive power, but overwhelming, pervasive heat, the horrifying mechanics of destruction. The effectiveness of the flame tanks was not just a matter of heavy armor and long range, it was the specific horrifying mechanics of how the burning napalm mixture defeated the Japanese's subterranean defense strategy. The effects were devastating. and the reality of the weapon was so visceral that the flame tank crews, often operating within 50 to 100 yards of their targets, could see exactly what was happening, creating sights no one could ever forget. The flame tanks operated as the spearhead of the American assault. Marines followed about 50 yards behind the flame Shermans, clearing out anything that survived the fiery blast. Standard Shermans provided crucial heavy suppressive fire and followed closely to protect the flame Shermans as they moved within the necessary engagement range. The true genius and terror of the weapon lay in its fuel, the sticky burning mixture. When sprayed over Japanese positions, it was designed to seep through every entrance and ventilation opening. The flames did not need a direct line of sight to the soldiers inside. The fuel would travel deep into the narrow spaces, corners, and recesses of the underground fortresses. Once inside, the effects were multi-layered and lethal. The immediate flames and extreme temperatures of the 1500-degree Fahrenheit napalm were often the least of the trapped defenders' problems. Critically, the intense combustion of the fuel within the confined spaces rapidly consumed most of the oxygen inside the caves and tunnels. Even those soldiers who weren't directly reached by the flame stream would be severely affected by the pervasive heat and the total lack of breathable air, leading to rapid incapacitation or death by asphyxiation. Adding to the chaos, the Japanese had stored tons of ammunition and fuel inside those interconnected tunnels. When the flame mixture reached these caches, countless secondary explosions followed underground, ripping through the network, killing everyone inside, and in many cases, burying others alive under rockfalls. U.S. troops often utilized explosives to seal the tunnel openings, trapping any surviving Japanese soldiers still alive underground. In a final chilling testimony to the horror, the U.S. troops could sometimes hear the muffled grenade detonations and rifle shots coming from deep inside the sealed tunnels, indicating the desperate final moments of the trapped men. Even high ground and elevated positions, where Japanese defenders believed they were safe from ground assault, were not secure. The flame tank crews, demonstrating skill and ingenuity, would strategically angle their tanks on uneven terrain to fire above the usual elevation limit of their projectors. This allowed them to reach the tops of cliffs, dislodging Japanese defenders who thought their elevation provided security. There was even a documented instance where Japanese soldiers, facing the inevitability of a flamethrower attack, jumped off cliffs to avoid the agonizing fate of being burned alive. Desperate counters and relentless maintenance. The devastating impact of the flame Shermans shattered the carefully laid plans of the Japanese defense. Shock and panic ran rampant through the remaining defenders. General Kuribayashi's forces realized their standard 47mm anti-tank guns were doing minimal damage, often just bouncing harmlessly off the frontal armor of the flame-projecting Shermans. They desperately needed a counter, and they found one as disturbing as the flame tanks themselves: sacrificial suicide tactics. Japanese soldiers began employing desperate measures, running directly at the American tanks with explosives strapped to their bodies. Their goal was to sacrifice themselves to save their comrades by disabling the terrifying flame weapon. Although most never reached the tanks due to the close infantry protection surrounding the flame Shermans, some did succeed in their grim task. Tragically, flame tank number 438 was destroyed on March 11th in precisely this way. When a Japanese soldier detonated his explosives on the tank's engine compartment, killing 3 crewmen, General Kuribayashi was forced to report the catastrophic effectiveness of the new American weapon to his command. He stated plainly that the enemy's special flame tanks inflicted more damage than all their artillery and bombardment combined, and conceded that his forces possessed no effective way to counter them. This was a profound admission of failure against a weapon his ingenious defensive design had not foreseen. To maintain this crucial advantage, U.S. engineers and maintenance crews were forced into a relentless cycle of support. They worked around the clock to keep the highly complex flamethrower tanks operational and ready for the next assault. The tanks were constantly on the front line fighting or back behind the lines for maintenance, with all major repairs performed hurriedly during the night. The logistical demands were enormous. Fuel, the specialized sticky mixture, had to be prepared continuously, around the clock. The flame tanks would drive directly from the front line to the refueling point and immediately drive back into combat, performing this punishing routine for days on end. The crews, driven by the critical nature of their work, were often described as being beyond exhausted, but they had no choice but to push on. The immense effort proved worthwhile. Military analysts later estimated that the use of the flame tanks drastically lowered the overall casualty rate for U.S. Marines by approximately 40%. For every day the flame tanks operated, they saved hundreds of American lives that would have otherwise been spent in conventional assaults against the dug-in pillboxes. The sheer destructive power of the flamethrower, combined with the impenetrable armor of the Sherman, was the indispensable key to unlocking Kuribayashi's otherwise unbreakable fortress, the final Inferno and the legacy of fire. By mid-March, after over a month of brutal combat, the organized Japanese resistance across Iwo Jima had largely collapsed. However, ambushes, sniper fire, and individual attacks from the remaining deeply entrenched defenders continued for weeks, even after the island was technically declared secured. The final horrific phase of the battle culminated around March 21st. After 30 arduous days of fighting, the approximately 3,000 remaining Japanese defenders were cornered, preparing to make their absolute last stand in the deepest parts of the tunnel network. To completely crush this final concentrated resistance, the American command prepared for the largest flamethrower assault of the entire Pacific War. The 6 surviving original flame tanks were supplemented and reinforced with 4 new ones, which were urgently shipped from Hawaii to the front lines. The force was now ready to deliver the decisive blow. Flame Shermans and their regular Sherman counterparts advanced in a devastating formation, systematically setting fire to and blowing up every remaining defensive position and tunnel entrance in their path. The intensity of this single final day of assault was extreme. Over the course of that one day, the flame tanks fired a staggering 8,000 gallons of fuel mixture onto the final enemy strongholds. This overwhelming application of firepower broke the last organized Japanese defense completely, with many of the remaining soldiers meeting their end via the flamethrowers. Despite the intensity of the assault, the coordinated use of the flame tanks drastically mitigated American losses. During this final push, the Marines suffered 92 killed and 257 wounded, a casualty figure that was still far less than the losses a conventional, purely infantry-based assault on the final desperate Japanese positions would have produced. The sustained and grueling combat had severely tested the integrity of the mechanized force. Of the 10 Flame Shermans that saw action on Iwo Jima, 2 were ultimately knocked out. The remaining vehicles suffered continuous malfunctions from the demanding non-stop use. To keep the required number of tanks operational until the end, crews had to cannibalize parts from the most damaged machines to keep the others running. Following the securing of the island, the surviving flame tanks were shipped back to Hawaii. They were minutely examined, and their design was thoroughly refined. This post-battle analysis and improvement process was critical, eventually leading directly to the next generation of flame tanks, such as the M67 Zippo, a system that would be deployed and utilized heavily in the Vietnam War. The battle ended in a massacre for the defenders. Out of the original 21,000 Japanese soldiers who garrisoned Iwo Jima, fewer than 200 surrendered and survived. The vast majority are still on the island, with most of them buried within the very tunnels and caves they had spent a year digging. The total amount of fuel mixture fired by all flamethrowers on Iwo Jima, both handheld and tank-mounted, was an enormous quantity, estimated at some 360,000 gallons over the course of the battle, the indispensable weapon and future deployment. The conclusion of the horrific Battle of Iwo Jima solidified the flame tank's place as one of the most vital weapons of the Pacific campaign. The sheer devastation inflicted by the vehicles led to a unanimous consensus among U.S. Marines. They all agreed that if not for those tanks, they would not have captured Iwo Jima, and the already horrific casualty numbers, among the highest for any battle in Marine Corps history, would have been even greater. The military's assessment of the flame tank's effectiveness was overwhelmingly positive. The intelligence gathered from Iwo Jima, confirming that the tanks lowered the casualty rate for Marines by an estimated 40%, proved its worth as a necessary weapon for breaking fanatical, deeply entrenched defenses. Seeing this undeniable success, the American war effort immediately shifted gears. Planners went full steam ahead with the program to convert more Shermans into the flame variants. In preparation for the anticipated and potentially far bloodier planned invasion of the Japanese mainland, the Americans prepared approximately 70 Flame Shermans. The intent was to field an overwhelming force of these specialized tanks to minimize the colossal casualties expected during the final invasion of the home islands. Before the full invasion could take place, however, the flame tanks were deployed once more. They were used again during the relentless and bloody Battle of Okinawa, one of the final major campaigns of World War II. On Okinawa, the tanks were pitted against Japanese defenses constructed with the same determined ferocity and utilizing similar deep cave networks. Against these new Japanese strongholds, the Flame Shermans proved just as effective, consuming over 200,000 gallons of the napalm mixture in the final days of the war. The combat experience of Iwo Jima and Okinawa provided invaluable real-world data to the U.S. engineers. The technical refinements gained from maintaining, operating, and eventually examining the surviving tanks in Hawaii ultimately led to the development of highly successful subsequent systems. This chain of innovation resulted in the later generation of flame tanks, most famously the M67 Zippo, which was successfully deployed during the Vietnam War. The 8 secret Shermans that landed on Iwo Jima did more than just break a fortress. They fundamentally changed the tactics of warfare against entrenched positions and cemented the legacy of the armored flamethrower. They were the essential, if brutal, tool that minimized the toll on American forces and delivered victory in the bloodiest battle the Marines had ever faced.